My name is Pearl McHaney. I'm the Kenneth M. England Professor of Southern Literature at Georgia State University, where I did my degrees. I'm also a Georgian since 1979. This is The Lamb in His Bosom and Beyond, Georgia's Pulitzer Prize winners. I first gave this talk at the Coastal Georgia Historical Society for their Chautauqua series, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Pulitzer Prize. As you probably know, Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper magnate, established an endowment to recognize excellence in journalism and the arts. Awards are made for work published in the previous year. Thus, Caroline Miller's novel, The Lamb in His Bosom, was published August 30, 1933, and was eligible for the 1934 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. But before discussing Lamb in His Bosom, its author, and the prize, I'd like to provide some context. From the beginning of the Pulitzer Prizes, as defined in Joseph Pulitzer's 1904 will, 4 prizes were to be awarded in American letters and drama: recognition for a novel, a play, a biography, and a U.S. history. The prizes were $1,000 each, save for the History Award, which was $2,000. In 1917, the first year, the prizes were awarded only to history and biography. The first prize for a novel was awarded the next year, 1918. 30 years later, in 1948, the prize was awarded for fiction instead of for novel, so that it could conceivably be awarded to a selection of short stories. Currently, there are 7 prizes in this category of letters, drama, and poetry. Poetry was added in 1922, music in 1943, and general fiction 1962. Currently, the fiction prize is designated, quote, for distinguished fiction published in book form during the year by an American author, preferably dealing with American life, and the prize is now $10,000. When Caroline Pafford Miller won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel Lamb in His Bosom in 1934, it was the nadir of the Great Depression, with an estimated 13 to 15 million people unemployed. And the $1,000 prize, adjusted for inflation, would today be the equivalent of almost $18,000, nearly double today's prize of $10,000. We'll return to this historical context in a bit, but for now I'd like to turn to the local hero, Lamb in His Bosom, the 1934 Pulitzer Prize novel, the title of which comes from Isaiah 40:11. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. Caroline Pafford, the daughter and granddaughter of Methodist ministers, was born in 1903 in Waycross, in Ware County. When Caroline was in junior high, her father died, and her mother died just a few years later when Caroline was a junior in high school. Alice Phelan, writing in the woman's magazine Holland's, the Magazine of the South, interpreted this bit of biography thusly: Caroline, quote, learned the meaning of death, the death of those nearest. She was alone, and yet her ambitions soared. She would be something more than average. She would be an actress. Melodramatic, to say the least, but we should take from this recounting that Caroline had ambitions, and being orphaned may have led to her next step. For in 1921, after graduation, Caroline married her high school English teacher, William Dews Miller, and they moved to Baxley in Appling County, where her husband taught English and then became the school superintendent. 6 years later, the Millers' first son was born, and 2 years after Bill Jr., the twin boys, nicknamed Nip and Tuck, were born. Caroline Pafford Miller had literary ambitions from the time that she was a teenager. A one-act play took first honorable mention in 1928 in a competition in Savannah, and she seemed to have thought then that instead of acting, her talent was in writing. Phelan, still in the women's magazine Holland's, writes, when the twins were but 3 days old, Mrs. Miller wrote a letter saying that she was giving up her ambitions to make a name for herself and that the children would have to accomplish what she had hoped to do. Miller reported, While I wash dishes and baby clothes, and I've washed thousands, I decided to hire someone else to do that sort of thing, and that it was up to me to do something worthy of myself. Some women find satisfaction in managing a beautiful home, but that doesn't satisfy me. And while that part of the story is not recorded elsewhere that I have found, the next piece is told frequently. Miller put her 3 sons in the back seat of the car and began to drive out from Baxley, out over the country roads, many of them not roads at all, she said, just ruts, into the heart of the pine woods, to gather stories of the older generations, those of her grandparents' era, those who managed the drudgery of existence with many fewer aids than she had, even in the financial destitution of the Depression. Quote, she would find a lonely farmhouse and ask to buy a fryer or some vegetables. She told her interviewer, 9 times out of 10, they won't have them, so it doesn't cost very much. She learned how women were spinning thread to weave cloth for the family's clothes. She learned what they cooked, which tasks were essential, heard their language. He's as shut-mouthed as an old burnt-out match. And the children were as barefooted as a barnyard dog. Miller commented that, barefooted as a barnyard dog, that's the quintessence of all barefootedness. The scene in which Miller's protagonist, Cian Carver Smith, all alone with her children, gives birth to her first baby boy, and pretty immediately thereafter kills a panther that had come inside the cabin seeking the birth blood that he smelled. This is one story that Miller had heard told. She wrote while the children played, asking her 7-year-old to give her names for Cian's cows. She wrote at a little table at Barnes' drugstore on Baxley's main street. Like other women, before and after her, Miller escaped the stultifying mundaneness of being a wife and a mother by writing a story of others. And it is her circumstances, I believe, in the Depression, in the wiregrass and piney wood country of southeast Georgia, with 3 young children, that infuses Lamb in his bosom with the realistic power of being a woman divided, of never having a self from the moment of leaving her parents' home, of being newly married, breaking land for crops to survive on, too soon birthing and burying children. Miller completed a novel prior to Lamb in his bosom, one titled Judas Tree, and when she read that Julia Peterkin, a Southern woman, had won a Pulitzer Prize, she wrote to Peterkin to ask what to do next, how to get her book published. Peterkin generously offered the name of her literary agent in New York. Judas Tree was rejected all around, but Harper sent a sufficiently kind letter to encourage Miller to send the publishing company Lamb in his bosom when it was completed a few years later. In mid-June 1933, the New York Times Book Review published a full page listing selected books scheduled for publication during the summer. Lamb in his bosom is one of more than the 300 titles listed. From the pre-publication galleys, the novel garnered positive reviews, such that just 1 week after its launch, August 30, 1933, the New York Times carried a large ad. An exciting discovery. Out of the season's crop of new books comes a first novel so good, so interesting, that overnight it has fired the enthusiasm of those who recognize merit when they see it. Discover for yourself Lamb in his bosom, first novel by Caroline Miller. The ad lists 7 blurbs from the week's reviews. The New York Evening Post and Louis Gannett already recommending this first novel by Caroline Miller for the Pulitzer Prize. Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature just 3 years earlier, in 1930, praised the novel for its fine sense of beauty. Dorothy Canfield, popular author and maven of literary tastes, through her leadership in the Book of the Month Club, called Lamb in his bosom quite perfect of its kind. The language is beautiful. The New York Herald Tribune predicted that the book would continue to be read and loved. Reviews in the Waycross Journal-Herald, the Atlanta Journal, the Savannah Evening News, and the New York Times Book Review followed within the week. Reviewers compared this first novel with successful work by Southern authors Evelyn Scott, Elizabeth Maddox Roberts, William Faulkner, Ellen Douglas, and Julia Peterkin for its, quote, grasp of human currents that transcends regionalism. Lamb in his bosom was in competition for the Pulitzer with the first novel of Florida author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, South Moon Under, and Gladys Hasty Carroll's blockbuster about a Maine farm family, As the Earth Turns, the second bestseller in 1933 after Hervey Allen's Anthony Adverse. Reviewers found Lamb in His Bosom less sentimental than Carroll's book and more moving than Rawlings and Carroll's. The New York Sun reviewer declared Miller writes simply and quite superlatively well, and with more poise and lift, for example, than Miss Carroll. Despite the completeness of her knowledge of the Georgia background, the authority of her documentation, Mrs. Miller never allows one to be unduly conscious that she had written a period novel. The Carvers are as alive and as fully realized as if they walked and breathed today, and their story is a very notable addition to American fiction. Miller's characters are, quote, intelligent, resourceful, and resilient people, with personalities as developed and as sharply divergent as one might find anywhere. They are, in short, anything but clods. All this transpired in 1933, before Lamb in His Bosom was selected by the Pulitzer Prize jury and recommended to the 14-member board for the Pulitzer, who would deliver their suggestions to the president of Columbia University to make the final announcement in May 1934, marking 30-year-old Caroline Miller as the first Georgian to win the Pulitzer Prize in the letters, drama, and music category. Lamb in His Bosom was the third Southern novel to win the prize, after Peterkin's Sister Scarlet Mary in 1929, and T.S. Stribling's The Store that had won the year before. In 1926, Julia and Julian Harris, son of Joel Chandler Harris, were the first Georgians to win the Pulitzer. Their newspaper, the Columbus Enquirer-Sun, won for, quote, the service which it rendered in its brave and energetic fight against the KKK, against the enactment of a law barring the teaching of evolution, against dishonest and incompetent public officials, and for justice to the Negro, and against lynching. Reviewers describing Lamb in His Bosom compared it to the other bestsellers, distinguished its merits, defined the genre, and most importantly, guided readers. Unlike today, there were multiple important newspapers in New York City, with reviewers who vied to be the first to call out books that would become bestsellers and books that were faulty. Reviewers sought to provide context and guidance without telling too much of the plot. Mary Ross reviewed Lamb in His Bosom for the New York Herald on September 3, 1933, the first Sunday of the novel's publication, with the headline, Rhythm of Backcountry Life. A new Southern novel recalls the simple beauty of As the Earth Turns and South Moon Under. I find Ross's instructions to readers helpful. She writes, the test of a good regional novel is that one should want to give it to a discriminating friend who is traveling to that part of the country because it would help him to understand the places and customs he was about to see. Leaving out the limiting adjective regional, the fundamental test of a novel, she continues, on the other hand, might be just the opposite, that one would urge a friend to read it just because he might never visit the places or know the kinds of people about which it is written, but through its insight would gain added vicarious experience in living to illuminate his own perspectives. The vitality and authenticity of a real novel give it a life of its own, special and individual, as in all experience, yet so deeply grasped that it makes intelligible and beautiful through some varying form the fundamentals on birth, life, and death that all humans hold in common. A good novel is thereby one that is specific enough to create both the real and the vicarious experience, and be individual and specific at the same time as revealing the universal. I add to this that for many readers, the integration of reading one book with other books one has read is also rewarding. The Macon Telegraph reviewer, for example, highlights the regional experience revealed in Lamb in His Bosom and compares it with Rolvag's Dakota novel, Giants of the Earth, or James Boyd's Drums for the Carolinas, Joel Chandler Harris's retold Southern folk tales, Will Harbin and Robert Loveman from Dalton for North Georgia, Cora Harris, Emily Dickinson, and Sarah Orne Jewett are mentioned for women's perspectives. And he compares Lamb in His Bosom to the stark tragedies of the old Greek drama. It would seem a near impossible task to take on all of these writers in a first novel, but it happens with variations, even when reading the novel in 2016. Certainly here at St. Simon's or on the Georgia coast, Lanier's Marshes of Glynn come to mind, but as does the seeming inheritor of the piney woods, Janice Ray, with Ecology of a Cracker Childhood. But I also found myself thinking of Faulkner's richly imagined Yoknapatawpha as I read Lamb in His Bosom. With each book we read, we bring the whole of our experiences, our relationships, the places we've lived, the books that we have read. Lamb in His Bosom begins with Cian, leaving home with her new husband, traveling 6 miles by ox cart to the log cabin Lonzo Smith has built for them. We learn this primarily through the point of view of Cian's younger brother, Jake, who thinks disconsolately and without any irony about his loss. There wasn't anything to do. Cian had gone and done it. She made her bed. Now let her lie in it. She wouldn't even know he, Jake, cared neither. She wasn't his sister anymore. She was all Lonzo's. Now she would sleep in Lonzo's bed instead of Jake's. At this thought, misery almost suffocated the child. He found it hard to draw his breath out of his lungs, for he could shut his eyes and feel her body warming his body under the covers. She had a way of rounding his head into her shoulder, for catching his legs up against her with her strong, lean hand, and they would sleep so, their bodies fitted one to another. In the night, they might turn, and then his thin body would fit in a protecting curve along her back. Miller provides us with this sensitive, tactile description of young Jake's emotion. I'm reminded that Carrie Pafford was the youngest of 7 children, and think perhaps that as a little girl she slept so with an older sibling. I think of Caddy loving Benji in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, sleeping with him, of the comfort and safety that Benji felt, almost lacking when Caddy had gone away. As Cian and Lonzo's bodies jounced gently in the slow motion of the wooden-wheeled cart, I think of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, with Darl and Jewel riding away while Addie is dying. And then this recalls to me how the boy Vardaman reacted in anger and cursing when his mother died in association with the doctor arriving. This is like Miller's young Jake when Cian faints in the shock and heat of realizing the enormity of having conceived a child that for the first time moved within her. When she comes to from the faint, quote, Cian saw Jake in the door, ready to run away and hide, his face a misery of fear. Jake disappeared from the door and ran away to the crib and burrowed his face in the rough, dry ears of corn. It weren't nothing, Jake. I'm a-going to find a baby afore long, that's all it were. When she was gone from sight, he ran back to the slipping mound of corn and found the farthest corner of the crib and lay shivering, his face in the musty, dry ears. Major, his old, blear-eyed hound, came sniffing under the crib door and whined. Jake spoke to him from the rough, sliding hill of last year's corn. Shut up, Major. Cian is quick, analytical, clever-minded, creative, and versatile. Still, after she outlines for herself and for us, her readers, she thinks, after taking care of her husband's meals and laundry, she belonged to herself, too. This phrase, belonged to herself, too, startled me, meaning not responsible or belonging to her parents any longer, responsible for taking care of herself, her own woman, but is this independence? And we find out quickly that she will soon have a child to care for, and Cian, without knowing that she will bear 15 children and bury several, has the prescient sense that, quote, it was all like wood beads on a cotton string, coming one after another, as even and close together as beads on a string. Unlike Faulkner's Lena Grove in Light in August, who is so unbothered by time and her pregnancy that progress is infinitesimal, is, quote, like a shabby bead upon a mild red string of road. The peaceful and monotonous changes between darkness and day are like an already measured thread being rewound onto a spool. Opposite of this placid Lena Grove, Cian belonged to herself for only a brief moment. She is a woman, but she wisely acknowledges that a woman has to be stronger than a man. It's a commonplace notion that there are only two stories to be told. A man goes on a journey, and a stranger comes to town. Both of these stories are operative in Lamb in His Bosom, even if we go back to that very beginning. Cian goes on a journey to her new life with a stranger to the Carver family, her new husband, Lonzo Smith. The unknown, the other in Miller's novel, is not only the natural and painful and exhausting work of breaking land and birthing and burying children. The other in the novel is the coast, a place of mystery, danger, commerce, a place for men and growing boys only. It's an 80-mile, 4-day journey one way, made once a year to sell crops and goods and buy necessities. And the coast is where Cian's older brother, Leas, falls in love with a stranger, Margot, a prostitute, whom he brings home as a wife. For Margot, quote, ached for Leas, as an airless void aches for rushing wind, as parched earth must cry for rain. This intense love sustains Margot, who becomes the second strongest pioneer of the novel, showing nearly unbelievable love, patience, and wisdom. God is an omniscient and omnipotent power in the lives of the Carvers and Smiths. Cian had 2 baby girls in quick succession, neither an easy birth, and she felt, quote, sad when she remembered that the first child had its mother to itself hardly any time at all before its sister scourged itself into their mother's heart. Even the mother's milk had been taken out of that first child's mouth, because the jealous presence of the second child was poison. With no babies in a 2-year span, Cian, quote, knew that it were a sin for a woman to crave to be free and easy and unencumbered in this here life. She had sinned in wanting to frolic and joke and find delight in this world. Never did she tell Lonzo that during those past 2 years she had planned and managed to have no children for him. That he would never have forgiven her, and well she knew it. I cannot stress enough how fully realistic are Miller's understandings of the joy and the terrible, wretched mental and physical pain and mental anguish that come with bearing and raising children. The novel is an education for men and a comfort of understanding for women. Although the labels are not in Miller's book, we read of the physical weakness from having children in quick succession, the loss of blood and iron, the pain of mastitis, breast infections, the incapacitation of postpartum depressions. Cian's 2 years of herself finding delight in this world, of not being pregnant, come to account, she believes, when after 6 children, her twin sons are born before their time, and are dead before they ever breathed. Quote, never could she figure out why the little fellers had not lived unless it was God Almighty's way of showing Cian her place. You didn't get off with just praying and crying over a sinful thing. God would hold your feet to the fire. He'd cause you to remember again and again as long as you lived, and just so often must you repent all over again. Weren't it exactly 2 years that Cian had made out between Kissy and Cal to have no more children? Well then, these 2 little boys, given cold and white to her arms, were children that she had murdered in her heart 10 years ago. It's a harsh judgment that Cian gives herself, but in her world there must be causes and effects. Accounts must be justified before any progress can be made. Miller demonstrates over and over that feelings, what Eudora Welty claims as the archangels of fiction, are the universal powers that create literature that lasts, that wins Pulitzer Prizes. Eudora Welty writes also of the importance of place, grounding and rooting the story, and this Miller does beautifully too. While Cian's mother longs for her Carolina silver poplars, jasmine, boxwoods, and apple trees, Cian knows only the Georgia woods. All through the flatwoods, pines heaved in their deep moorings in the earth. They rocked to the south when the north wind blew, and they rocked to the west when the east wind blew. But when the winds were gone back into the east and north, and there fell a quiet, balmy day, the pines were straight as ever, moored fast to the black, deep, coiled roots of the old earth herself. In summer nights, the katydids cried, clinging to one long, steely, harsh note in the midst of a din of notes of 1,000 other insect creatures. Cian had never tasted an apple, had never been and would never go to the coast, but Caroline Miller was very fond of St. Simon's. Late in life, not well, Miller wrote to a friend who had discovered genealogical and place roots with the Pulitzer Prize winner. Miller wrote of St. Simon's, "My very favorite spot on earth. Many a time that I crabbed off that old pier, how dear to my heart. Old Mantime sleeps on the island and often naps in the daytime while nothing ever happens." She continued also to recall with exquisite language the feeling of her early days in the piney woods. In 1971, from Waynesville, North Carolina, where she had lived for 30 years, she wrote, "I walked under Waycross's old oaks to school so long, and green and gold glimmered through the long corridor of the old church street, feeling everything with a certain study of spring I never found anywhere else. The leaf buds of pine trees have a very special beauty. I haven't seen oaks or pines for a long time." Reflecting back to 1944, when her second book was being published, Miller said, "I was sick of the Pulitzer business and the brutal spotlight of publicity. I so want to belong to a small town and small life. I'm afraid of another bestseller. A small person in a small town, in my thinking, near being the happiest person, though he may know it only many bitter and weary years later." Such sentiments evolved from a couple of things. The Pulitzer Prize did cause an incredible whirlwind, buying clothes, taking the train to New York, teas and coffees and luncheons and speeches and more. She spoke of herself as Cinderella, the Pulitzer fanfare as a fairy tale, and everyone was charmed by the lovely, naive, vivacious princess. Upon her return home, more than 2,500 people greeted Miller at the Baxley train station, and she and her family rode home in an ox cart, just as Cian and Lonzo had traveled to their home. And then there were hundreds of letters and calls and telegrams each day, telephone and in-person interviews, travels to towns and cities in Georgia, Jessup, Fitzgerald, Waycross, Savannah, Macon, and Atlanta, for more teas, coffees, luncheons, and speeches. All this with 3 young boys and a husband needing her attention. A few reviewers recognized the powerful message of the novel in relation to the dire conditions of the Depression. In the New York Herald Tribune, perhaps to demonstrate the relevance of this novel of back-country life told without melodrama or self-consciousness, Mary Ross concluded, "I suspect that this year of helplessness and chaos and want in cities or farms has often given an added appeal to the novel that deals with the self-sacrificing family of earlier American times. More subtle regarding the Depression, about which historians cite as the pioneering spirit as that which helped Americans make optimism out of the most pessimistic atmosphere possible, was the following statement by Jane Judge in the Savannah Morning News. "One becomes conscious in reading this touching chronicle not only of the vital power and immediacy of the backwoodsman's religion, but of his sensitiveness to beauty and his reaching out to the wonder and loveliness of nature to satisfy that hunger. That such longing could survive the cruel harshness of this primitive life is only one of the revelations Mrs. Miller gives us of the mysteries of the human spirit." Back in Baxley, Caroline's husband, William Miller, soured on his wife's success and claimed authorship of the Pulitzer Prize novel. Perhaps it was the new money, the equivalent of $18,000 in the destitute years of the Depression. Perhaps it was playing second fiddle to the hundreds clamoring for Caroline's attention. Whatever the details, which burned in the Ware County Courthouse, the divorce papers were filed. Will went to court to claim custody of their first son, Bill Jr. Caroline's father-in-law testified that he was afraid that Caroline would abscond with the 3 little boys to Mexico and he would never see them again. In her 70s, Caroline recalled the old silver-haired judge who had leaned forward a little and made a statement ponderously. "I knew her father. She will never do anything that is illegal or underhanded." After the divorce, Caroline and the boys spent a year in Biloxi, Mississippi, in the home facing the Gulf. They sailed and read books, took long walks along the shore, caught crabs, and took oysters from the seawall. In the last year of her life, she told her son, Bill Jr., "That year in Biloxi was the happiest of my life." The family moved to Waynesville, North Carolina, where Caroline married Clyde Ray, had another son and a daughter. She continued to write and in 1944 published a second novel, Lebanon, a romantic novel in a similar time and setting as Lamb in His Bosom. Responding to the enormous success of Miller's 1934 Pulitzer Prize, coming from the unlikely region of Low Country, Georgia, Harold Latham, Macmillan's publishing agent, arrived in Atlanta for the 1935 Atlanta Writers Club luncheon, reportedly causing a bit of a stir among Atlanta authors and would-be authors. He was no doubt welcomed and encouraged by Norman Berg, the Atlanta Macmillan agent, and journalists including Frank Daniel, who had reviewed, interviewed, and lauded Caroline Miller at the previous year's meeting. The story that you may know goes along these lines. In a fit of exasperation, Margaret Mitchell, despite friends and competitors, finally sent several envelopes of typescript chapters of what would become Gone with the Wind to the train station, just in time for Mr. Latham to collect them. Much Ado About Everything followed, with the happy result that the 1,037-page novel was published the following year, June 30, 1936. Some historians and readers would have you believe that the success of Lamb in His Bosom leads quite directly to Latham coming to Atlanta and the successive publication of Mitchell's novel. Not that Gone with the Wind needed the attention, but it is intriguing to give Miller's novel credit for the renowned Atlanta Civil War romance. As with Lamb in His Bosom, Gone with the Wind received pre-publication notices and reviews that were wholly positive. February 9, 1936, before the galleys were even in New York, the Atlanta Constitution published a 350-word announcement of Peggy Mitchell's story of the lost cause with, quote, pathos of that never-to-be-forgotten era of pre-war, wartime, and Reconstruction days. Like Lamb in His Bosom, Gone with the Wind was a first novel, but this time by an Atlantan who was well-known in the city and a journalist, and the novel's setting could hardly be said to be of the bygone past, as the Civil War was a subject never lacking glorification. When the novel was selected for the Book of the Month Club, the publication date had to be moved up a month to accommodate additional printings. A month before the Pulitzer announcement, Caroline Miller sent a congratulatory letter to Mitchell and looked forward to meeting the Atlanta writer sometime in the future. Mitchell replied on April 7, 1937, "My dear Mrs. Miller, your letter made me very happy indeed, for your book is undoubtedly the greatest book that ever came out of the South about Southern people, and it is my favorite book. I think I was among the first in the state to read it, for Susan Myrick rushed up from Macon with it, insisted that I read it that night, and I did. I became violently enthusiastic as she was about it, and went about buttonholing people for weeks, telling them they had to read it so they could talk to me about it. I never wrote to tell you how fine a thing I thought it was, for even though I was not a front-page celebrity myself then, I realized what you were going through and did not wish to add another letter to your burden. But I went over to Athens to hear you speak to the Georgia editors, and my enthusiasm doubled, if possible. All of my family are mad about Lamb in His Bosom. They loved it. My father, who frequently says nothing worth reading has been written since the good Queen died, now says that 2 Georgia books are worth reading, yours and mine." The next day, Mitchell wrote to Herschel Brickell, reporting the correspondence and repeating her enthusiasm for the book. "I've wanted to meet her for a long time and could have done so easily, for we have many mutual friends. But even before I landed on the front pages, I realized that people in the public eye have no particular desire to meet anyone they can get out of meeting." She tells of Miller's divorce and says, "I wish to heaven Mrs. Miller had delayed the airing of her domestic difficulties for a year at least, for the addle-brained public has mixed me up with her. For some time the rumors were hot that I was in Reno, divorcing John and fighting for the complete custody of my 3 non-existent children." Among the pre-Pulitzer reviews was a New York Times review, page 1. This is beyond doubt one of the most remarkable first novels produced by an American writer. It is also one of the best. While it is not equal to Elizabeth Maddox Roberts' The Time of Man, nor as great as Tolstoy's War and Peace, it is, quote, "a long while since the American reading public has been offered such a bounteous feast of excellent storytelling, the best Civil War novel that has yet been written." The negative criticisms are couched in the great storytelling. For even if it lacks beauty in the language and is not a great novel, not one of any profound reading of life, it is nevertheless a book of uncommon quality, a superb piece of storytelling. Gone with the Wind and The Last Puritan by George Santayana seemed by bestseller status to be the top contenders for the 1937 Pulitzer Prize. The prize novel jury, the same jury that had selected Lamb in His Bosom 3 years earlier, reportedly felt, quote, some reluctance in giving a money prize and more publicity to two novels that had already earned so much money and publicity on the market, for which the critical buffeting as of a best-selling Pulitzer selection was strong and merciless. But on May 4th, 1937, the Pulitzer Prize for Novel was awarded for the second time to a Georgia author, to Margaret Mitchell, for her, what we would say today, blockbuster novel, Gone with the Wind. In the 11 months since its publication, 1,700,000 copies had been sold, and the movie contract was nearly signed. Its earnings at the time of the prize were said to be $500,000. That would be $8 million in today's dollars. Mitchell, acknowledging that it was her first novel, asserted that it was also her last. The division between popular bestseller fiction and quality literature, however, was demonstrated a month later after the Pulitzer Prizes were announced. When the American Writers' Congress met in June to decide on the best novel of the year, Gone with the Wind received only one vote. John Dos Passos' novel, The Big Money, received 350. And the charges about the novel's treatment of slaves that are a part of the academic discourse surrounding the novel today were raised in the Chicago Defender in March 37, preceding the Pulitzer. The anonymous reviewer writes that in Mitchell's fairy tale, quote, not one example of the mistreatment of slaves is shown, not one example of a slave proud and wise who wanted to be free. Negroes in the book sing Go Down Moses, but the author seems not to understand what they mean. The old forms of slavery are safely gone, but new forms of slave labor are growing. Fascism will find many minds more friendly toward it because this book was read. On the other hand, many women saw the novel as significantly contemporary. The real stroke of genius is in the story of Scarlett's struggles to survive. It's the story of thousands of young and older women during the Depression. It is so very modern. Thousands of women have lived it since the crash of October 1929. In her talks to readers in Atlanta and Macon, Mitchell repeated pieces of the discussion she had had with her editors. She especially didn't want to write about Southern degenerates, as she and many readers would describe Erskine Caldwell's and William Faulkner's characters. Sanctuary, Faulkner's potboiler about an old Miss Coed in the underworld of Memphis, Tennessee, was published in 1931. And Erskine Caldwell's Tobacco Road, that describes the body-breaking and soul-numbing effects of poverty among Georgia's tenant farmers during the Great Depression, and his God's Little Acre, 1933, involving the abuse of Southern industrial workers and the disintegration of the family, both capitalized on the raw rendition of sex. They had been cited as among the most significant 20th century texts. But Mitchell was intent on disassociating her characters from the likes of Popeye and Jeter Lester. Nonetheless, the success of her novel and the demands on Mitchell were exponentially greater than that experienced by Lamb in His Bosom and Caroline Miller. The family's favorite getaway was to Sea Island off the coast of Brunswick. She wrote to Alfred and Lynn Lunt after they performed in Atlanta, Sea Island is a small island lying across the marsh from the larger and more historic St. Simon's Island. There's a lovely tidal river which meanders through the marshes of Glynn. At St. Simon's Island, there is a stillness of the marsh water and the trees like the day after creation, and this stillness never fails to have a very soothing effect on the weary and harassed pair of Mitchell and her husband. 1934, Lamb in His Bosom. 1937, Gone with the Wind. And then, 48 years later, 1983, The Color Purple by Eatonton, Georgia native Alice Walker, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The prize was still $1,000, but it was no longer the Depression. The dollar equivalent today would be just $2,416, not the $18,000 value of Miller's prize. The Color Purple, Walker's third novel, also won the American Book Award for Fiction. Published June 2, 1982, it sold steadily even before the prizes, 40,000 copies, 6 printings. But the Pulitzer pushed the novel to number 10 on the New York Times bestseller list. The story of Celie and her sister Nettie, Celie's powerful and real life-saving friendship with Shug, is set in Middle Georgia. As the Pulitzer was announced, the New York Times reviewer summarized The Color Purple, the novel, thusly. The novel focuses on Celie, at first a poor girl enslaved and abused by black men, in the end freed and endowed with a sense of self-worth by 2 rebellious black women. Miss Walker is the first black woman to win the Fiction Award. Walker said, "With the book, I wanted to reach a mass market. I wanted to reach the supermarket crowd. The reason the book has done so well up to now is because of the Pulitzer, not because of initial marketing techniques. The high point of this whole business with Purple was not when they told me about the awards, but when they told me about the people in New York City subway who were reading it. That's the first time I felt I had connected with my audience." With the prizes came an immediate clamor for movie rights. Walker commented that the first shock was that someone would give it the Pulitzer. Who are these sweet people? But so challenging did it become to write a 2-hour screenplay of an 8-hour book. To witness, Walker said, your work becoming something untoward your creative accomplishment, to be inundated with opinions in the press, as Margaret Mitchell also endured, and to some extent without the movie making, so too Caroline Miller. That Walker wrote a book of the experience, The Same River Twice, Honoring the Difficult, a meditation on life, spirit, and the making of the film, The Color Purple. "Fame exhausts me more than anything else it does," she said. A year after the Pulitzer, 2 years after the novel's publication, she wrote, "I am still tired of being recognized by the Pulitzer Prize. I am sent countless manuscripts to read, books to endorse. There are invitations and awards offerings I couldn't accept. More mail than I thought existed. How rare, too, now, to get a letter from someone I actually know. But I'm slowly getting back my strength. And in the country, I am very, very happy. The days are long and golden. They seem almost endless, and the full moons are astonishing. There is hay stacked neatly in the neighbors' fields, and everywhere we look, there's beauty." Caroline Miller and Margaret Mitchell and Alice Walker make a fine trio of strong, talented writers whose work and imaginations and strong women characters show us, in different ways, how to understand ourselves. All 3 put language to the task of revealing the beauty of the land of Georgia. They bear witness to the 100th anniversary of the Pulitzer Prize that so honored our native daughters. Walker wrote, "It is, in the end, the saving of lives that we writers are about. Whether we are minority writers or majority, it is simply in our power to do this. We do it because we care."